Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Revolution of Being podcast. Today, we are diving into what is probably one of my favorite topics, and that is the topic of victimhood. Now, when we talk about victimhood, I just want to clarify to start what that means. It can mean a lot of different things. It can mean not taking responsibility for your life. It can mean allowing yourself to be defined by the traumas that have happened to you. It can mean not realizing the choices you have in everyday circumstances or situations. And so, again, this is a theme we've talked about in quite a few podcasts, but I really want to isolate the specific topic today and dive even deeper. So, when we are born, right, we know our little minds are these little sponges that just absorb everything around us. They train us how to react. They train us about the different expectations in our family, the roles we play, the social dynamics that exist. And quite often as children, we're not given sovereignty because we're learning, right? So we're learning, we're being guided, but we're also not given opportunities quite often to make mistakes with conscious choice, to learn from those mistakes and do better. And we see that right now with even the trophy generation, right? There's a huge movement of like participation trophy kids who simply for showing up, you get kudos. And there's no longer this, first place, second place, third place, like simply because you're there, you're all winners. And that's not really life. And that can lead to people feeling like little victims if they don't get the accolades that they were expecting or hoping for. And we're not saying this out of any sense of being cruel to children or in any way, but moreover, that we want to teach resilience. We want to teach the power of control that we really do have in life. And, you and I talk about trauma a lot. We both had pretty substantial trauma in our childhood. And that defined a lot of my lived experience, really until kind of the last, 5 to 6 years, where I was going about life quite unconsciously. I didn't recognize the power I had to make different decisions because I was kind of indoctrinated to just believe in very simple terms, go to college, go to high school, go to college, get a job, work at a job you're not happy with, maybe get married, have some kids, whatever, eventually retire and then die. And there's so much that happens in those 60, 70, 80 years. And really the reality is at every point along our journey, we are empowered with different choices we can make. And, I speak to when I was working as a nurse, I was the breadwinner in our house. I had the health insurance. I really felt kind of stuck that if I left this job, you know, I wouldn't be able to make the money I was making. I wouldn't be able to have insurance that would cover my two children and my two stepchildren, and that there would be drama and tension if that boat got rocked. And so for a long time, I really felt kind of victimized in the fact that like I'm in this circumstance that's very complicated. I don't have a choice because every opportunity felt like it was kind of a trap. And it wasn't until my first coach around 2020, 2021 called me out on that and really said, like, you're choosing this. You're choosing the partner you have. You're choosing the job you have. You're choosing to stay stuck. You're choosing to allow what happened to you when you were little to define you in your trauma, and really like hold on to that as though people can't change. And so, this is such a big topic of discussion that when I started to understand everything is a choice, that I don't have to be the identity of the person who was a traumatized child. I don't have to be the identity of a nurse. I don't even have to be the identity of a partner. Like I can do whatever I choose to. That was where I think my mind kind of cracked open. And it's terrifying, right? To realize that we have all this power. And we see that in society right now, right? Like the weight loss epidemic. Everybody's running to Ozempic because they want a quick fix because their bodies betrayed them. But no one's willing to get honest with the fact that you're eating like crap and you're not working out, And in some cases, yes, there are situations where the body is just not working optimally, but there are root cause reasons why. And it's not fixed with a shot. It's not fixed with a quick fix solution. It's diving in to understanding really what's going on beneath the surface. And that really is the shadow work, right? So when you start to understand what happened to you, that it, let's go back to the childhood trauma, right? Some of the things that happened in my childhood, I was absolutely a victim in some situations, right? Like as a young child, when you are in a home that's very chaotic and you don't feel safe, no child consciously is like, this is where I want to stay. They don't know any different. Or maybe if they do, they're still stuck because you're 6, 7, 8, 10 years old and you don't yet have autonomy. So in a case like that, when you're a young child, you can absolutely be victimized. However, if you're 20, 30, 40 years old and that's still defining you, that is where the choice comes in. That is where you're taking something that happened and allowing it to be what defines you. And so I don't want to, you know, I want to hear your opinion and kind of feedback on this, Jess, because again, this is something we talk about very often, and it really is a discussion that can go off into so many different arenas. So I'll have you kind of steer me in because you're so good at that, and I'd love to just kind of get your perspective on this conversation.
There's this range when it comes to victimhood. There is such a huge range, and nobody is really going to fall in the same area on that spectrum. You know, you don't get a choice to become a victim usually. Like, especially if you're a child or you don't know. And I think that that's one of the harder parts, at least for me. That is a hard part. So let's just talk about that for a minute. Let's not talk so much about, I think our audience, I think the people that listen to this, I think they realize um, when they're choosing as a conscious adult to become a victim. I think we know when we do that, right? You and I vent to each other. We know when we're doing that.
Mhm.
And we can kind of come back and correct each other and kind of have that moment of like, that's right. I kind of teed myself up for this. I can take my power back here. So that's, we talk about like big T, little t trauma. Let's just talk about like that being our little v victim, right? Okay, so that's our little v victim. And now let's talk about our big V victim, because that one's the harder one. That's the one I've dealt with. I know you've dealt with that. And it's it's taken me a really long time, and I still have to work on this all the time. So big V victim is is something that probably happened early in life that set the stage for maybe big V victim stuff later in life. So the early stuff, in my situation, it was a lot of coercive control. So as a little child, I I feared for my physical safety and my mostly my physical and not being left. And it came, I guess you could say, kind of in the form of terror. And it's taken me a long time not to make excuses for people who did that to me, because I know they had bad pasts. I know that. I know they were victimized as well. But I was too. And so when you talk about that big V victimhood, those moments in life, if you're a small child and you have no other home, you have no protector, you have nowhere to hide, you have to survive.
Yeah.
And survival means that you push down anything that could be perceived as putting you in danger. Maybe it's your emotions, maybe it's you know, standing up for yourself, any of that kind of stuff. But what that does is it starts to rewire your brain. And I think a bruise to the face would be easier for me to handle than a bruise to the brain, because that's what this does. This is stuff that will feed the rest of your experiences in life until you realize it. So, big V victimhood, people that have endured physical, sexual abuse, um, psychological abuse, especially when they're in their formative years. Now, fast forward to people that are our age, they're adults, young adults, middle aged adults, older adults. We can be the victims of big V abuse too. That comes in the form of domestic violence. Maybe we had we got robbed or something like that. So we have all these big V. That's the kind of stuff I really want to dive into, because I think that this is what so many people walk around with, and it's just lying at the bottom, and it's kind of triggering all these little things in us, and we don't even know. I didn't know. I thought I was a strong woman. I mean, I started a business and I had a good career and I raised two great kids, but I didn't realize like the underlying rage that I felt, or not feeling heard or seen or safe. I didn't really know where that all came from, but it became my excuse to behave in certain ways until I started to get ownership of it. So I think in this episode, I'd love to talk about that big V trauma and what you see, especially with your clients. And I'm happy to share some of the things that I've done, because I know you and I have different big V traumas. And I think it's good to maybe talk about that.
Yeah.
And I'll talk about mine, and I'll talk about some of the things I've done and some of the misconceptions around how we address this. But again, this is where your freedom lives.
Mhm.
It lives here. And this is where that choice comes in. Like, you can let it sit there and you can let it be your excuse, and you can be miserable and you can seek familiar patterns and keep ending up in the wrong relationships or wrong jobs or whatever. Or you can listen to this podcast right here. We'll spill it for you. We'll give you a little bit of a roadmap, and you can start doing the hard work too.
Yeah. And, I've talked a little bit about my childhood experience, and, I've done a lot of work around everything that I've gone through. And I see that because I'm comfortable talking about this with vulnerability, knowing that it's going to land for somebody. So my parents were both um, their own levels of victims because of their childhood. My dad was in and out of foster care, had very volatile parents. My mom had a mother who went on to have a lot of kids. My mother became the caregiver of the younger children. Men were kind of in and out of her life when she was little. Didn't really have a relationship with her birth father. And, I suspect there was other abuse that happened in the home that we've just not unpacked. And so when you get two parents like that who have very dysfunctional childhoods, who meet at a very young age and then start a life together as babies themselves, right? Barely out of high school, it's a recipe for disaster. Again, if they've not done the work, if they're not aware of, kind of what their traumas are. And so that was, you know, what I was born into was parents who had their own deep wounding. And as a child, they were extremely volatile. I mean, they would get very physically abusive in front of us as children. Um, we would get spanked. There was never any, nowadays that would be considered child abuse, right? Back then it was normal. In the 80s, spanking a child for misbehaving was common. But that really messed me up, being in a home where I just never felt safe. I was walking on eggshells because I didn't know if the adults were going to be, on good behavior, or if they were going to be fighting and having their normal antics. And I had chronic urinary tract infections as a kid. In hindsight, I understand that was completely root chakra, like safety issues, because I felt so unsafe. And I remember when my parents, I think I was about 5 or 6, they finally moved into getting a divorce. And I had profound relief because that meant they weren't going to be together fighting, and the household tension was going to decrease. And now, mind you, I am a highly sensitive person. So not only like did I feel it, I felt it on a cellular level when the house was that destructive. And so my body internalized a lot of that, which again was the manifestation of UTIs, the manifestation of anxiety as a very young child. I saw the adult figures in my life not really showing me how to adult, how to have healthy relationships, how to even have healthy friendships. And so, they had gotten divorced. And what happened beyond there, I later started to understand was a lot of manipulation. us children as pawns. We were in the middle of two, again, very unhealthy people, and how, the one parent would use us to really irk at the other parent. And, it's heartbreaking to think about, because having my own kids, I would never, ever do that to them, and never put them in the middle and say things about their other parent that would in any way change their viewpoint, right? That's for them to discover. And I was really made to believe that my dad wanted nothing to do with us. And, he didn't have the right setup for us to even feel at home, and all these different things. So a lot of emotional kind of manipulation that I don't fault my mother for. It was her wounding. I understand it in hindsight, but it really damaged that relationship, and then fast forward to when I was 15, my dad died of a heart attack, and unexpectedly on my brother's birthday. Now, my brother has Down syndrome. It was his birthday, his 18th birthday. And, talk about another big T trauma. And of course, for anybody that loses somebody, it's a traumatic event. But what's even more important is how it's handled, how you're supported emotionally as you're going through that. And again, when you have a parent who themselves hasn't done the work, they are in no position able to really provide that themselves to their children. And she did the best she could. I mean, that was a devastating loss for her as well. But I, went on to later learn like how much my dad really wanted to be in our life, and all the things he had done to try to make himself present that were blocked. And that was heartbreaking. So when he died, I, at 15, turned to food and becoming anorexic, because if you know anything about anorexia, it's about control. I desperately wanted control in an environment where I didn't have any control that I perceived, right? And again, I'm young, I don't have a developed enough brain to really rationalize, process, do the things that maybe some other 15-year-olds could in a different home environment. And, it's so interesting because I had grown up seeing a mother who absolutely had such low self-esteem and a lot of disdain for herself, would always comment about her weight, her belly after having children, specifically me, and how I ruined her belly, and all these things directed at self-hatred and loathing. And now that's my example as a female, and what a female does to themselves, right? Never accepts a compliment, is constantly criticizing every aspect of their body, is constantly dieting, buying new exercise equipment, like punishing themselves, to be thin. And so I had a very dysfunctional relationship with food. And then, probably maybe 2 years later, that turned into more like the binge purge eating. And again, very dysfunctional, but desperately wanting control, and also numbing, like disassociating from my body. I didn't want to be in my body. And I was very unpresent. I couldn't kind of be with myself. And fortunately, around that age, I met my now husband, and he was like really grounding force for me to get through a lot. And we did break up, and that was kind of the next like big T for me, was that loss, because that was the first person I felt deeply connected to. And on a soul level, I knew he was my person. So it was also like a total mind F to be like, how did I know that this was my person? Like, I knew when I first met him, like there was a soul connection. And, story ends happily. We're together and happily married many years later. But there was a lot that was going on, and then going to college, moving to a new city, and trying to figure out this whole adulthood thing. And, the best thing I did was truly leave where I grew up, because I was surrounded by a lot of people that, amazing humans. I mean, really, good people, but they didn't have aspirations to do a whole lot with life. And, you know, um, being at the bar every night was what, they were excited about, and mediocre jobs, and just kind of this, not very fulfilling life that I knew I wanted more of. And so, yeah, around 18, 19, I had that kind of soul pull. I think it was about 19, to move. And so I moved to the Twin Cities, and then started to pursue my nursing degree at age 20. And that was kind of like the reset of my identity, was like trying to learn confidence, trying to feel like I belonged, right? Because I was like, oh my gosh, the city people are so much more fashionable. They know so much more than I do. I'm just a small town girl from like a farm town. And but being in the vicinity of people that had bigger dreams elevated me and really allowed me to just know that there was more. And, it still wasn't the end of my story, but I was still dealing with the eating disorders, at that time, into my early and mid 20s, because I still hadn't really done the deep work. And I ended up doing, not many people know this. I ended up doing an intensive outpatient program through the Emily program, which is a big national eating disorder space here. And I've gotten a scholarship, and that helped me kind of get that under control. But it really still didn't get to the core of why. It was helping reframe food and how to eat, but it really didn't help me deal with the trauma. And maybe in more time it would have, but it was more focused on learning your hunger cues, acknowledging that kind of what a normal portion size is and all of that I had to relearn because, again, for God, nearly 10 years, I didn't quite have a handle on that, or longer. And then when that kind of ended and I kind of got the food controlled, I turned to wine, and I started drinking a lot. And so I never really dealt with the trauma. And again, it wasn't until 2020 where I had kind of my dark night of the soul, where I was a frontline nurse. The world was going crazy. I had unbelievable anxiety to the point of being suicidal, and it was a really hard time because I had a 2.5-year-old and then a 5-year-old child. And I was in one of the darkest places I'd been, probably in like 15 years. And so that was the point where I decided to release alcohol. I was like, this isn't serving me. I'm either going to continue this path and self-destruct, um, or I'm going to start to figure it out. And that was really the ripping off of the bandage to start exposing the wounds. And it was through that I, did all these holistic things. I learned a lot about functional health. I learned a lot about mindset, and ultimately, hired a coach who helped me realize I'm not the victim. And that was the problem with every other therapist I'd ever had. And, this probably resonates for a lot of people. When I would go to therapy, we would just rehash all the reasons why I was a victim. And they never called me on it. Like, no one ever said, you have a choice here. I think they were too afraid to lose a client. And I think, unfortunately, that's a lot of therapists out there. They don't want to piss people off. And that didn't benefit me. That kept me stuck and kept me really believing that things were happening to me. And when my first coach said, you're not a victim, like, you're choosing all of this, you're allowing this to continue, I did my normal BS. I shut down. I got pissed off. I went into fight flight, but I had enough wherewithal to provide a little distance from that exchange, reflect on it, and think, maybe I'm missing something here. Like, maybe he's right. And that was the turning point of like, yeah, like, you have control. And, to your point of kind of rehashing my childhood, this is something I tell my clients to do. I don't mandate it, but I encourage, if they have a lot of unprocessed trauma, that this is a really excellent exercise to write your life story from birth to now. Write it in first person. When I was this age, this happened. When I was this age, this happened. Look at it, right? You're going to probably have a lot of stuff that's traumatic events. You might have some good stuff too, and then rewrite it in third person. When that little girl was 2, this happened. When that little girl was 10. And that broke me because I could see through a lens of compassion everything I had gone through and how dysfunctional it was, right? Because I just kind of dismissed it because it was my story. Like, whatever, that's just what happened. That's my life. But when I had that distance to see it as though it was a separate person outside of me, it helped me be compassionate to the maladaptive ways I learned to cope to survive, right? Like, none of us take on addictions. None of us take on disordered ways of eating or being or coping, people pleasing, whatever, just because we do it as a way to survive. And, that protects us to get us through that. But when you start to understand that, that's when you can begin to change it. And you can say, like, that served me. It doesn't anymore. And I'm a big girl now. I have big resources and I have new people around me, and a big part of that is being with people that are also doing the work, right? If you're going to stay with the same people that have been a part of that trauma or are in their own victimhood, you're going to sink with that ship. So that was a huge thing for me, was just gaining the awareness, because then I was able to heal. And so that's what a lot of my clients are going through. And a lot of them have um, trauma, and a lot of them are just desperate to move through it. The ones that succeed are the ones that take accountability, the ones that are like, whatever I need to do, I am willing to do to make this better. I trust you. Help me, please. The ones that aren't are the ones that want me to do the work for them. And I had somebody recently, and that was the case. And we ended up parting ways because, I was exclusively clear that I can't do this work for you. I can't force you to change when you don't want to. And you are wasting your time with me, like, because you're not ready for it. Like, no amount of hypnosis or coaching can override your desire to want to change. And it's taken me, a long time in the work I do now to realize, like, it's not my responsibility to fix anybody. I've got great tools, I've got great resources, and people that are ready for it do phenomenally. Those that don't last, or they, quickly don't work with me. So, there's so many ways we have trauma. And, I didn't even go into, stuff with my husband. We had a very tumultuous relationship with his ex that was very, very, very damaging for a long time. Um, and it was hard, it's complicated. I feel like I was the OG, like I was the first love, like, who are you, kind of thing. And it was complicated. And again, we're in our 20s, we're all, going through stuff and wounded. And we are in a different place now. Thank goodness. We've done our work, um and there's, it was hard, but I had a lot of PTSD that I had to work through. And that was a big reason why I ended up doing mushrooms this summer, right? Was that I've done everything I can do to heal that relationship. And I still have this like very physical, visceral reaction to those circumstances, that although my mind is healing, my body still is holding that trauma. And it's still there. It's getting better. I feel like it's gotten a lot better, but um, there's so many, and we don't have to go tit for tat on all the traumas, but I also just wanted to address, because this might resonate for people, um, that we don't also talk about religious trauma enough. I had a lot of religious trauma, a lot of guilt, because I was raised to believe that, God was this almighty person in heaven with a staff judging everything you do. And it was really put in our mind that, you are a sinner from birth, and only a select amount of people make it to heaven. Hopefully you make that cut. And it never resonated for me, but I still bought into it because that's what I was completely like infiltrated with, right? And so, if people are contending with that and just kind of questioning those narratives, do question them, because if it doesn't make you feel good, it's probably not the truth, right? Like, the truth of the abilities we have as humans, of our nature, the love that we get to encompass, like, this really does get to be a beautiful journey, and we get scars along the way, but they can also be the biggest catalyst for why you do what you do, the kind of person you become. I wouldn't be the compassionate person I am. I think I'm empathetic. Like, I think that's just who Angie, little soul Angie is. But all of the other things that happened really further drove into me a deep understanding of what people are going through, and profound empathy. And I think, you and I talk about this in the context of what's happening in the world and in politics. And I have deep compassion for people who are in their, limbic brain, their amygdala in fight, flight, triggered by politics, because they don't know. It doesn't have to be that way. They don't realize that, one of the foundations of NLP, which is neurolinguistic programming, and a lot of hypnotists are trained in it. One of the foundations is understanding that everybody is doing the best they can with the resources they have at the time. And if we could all just understand that, it would really open up deep healing in people too. And you and I talk about that with our parents. Like, we understand our parents were doing the best that they could at the time, and that messed us up, right? Like, that was, so it's not mutually exclusive, right? We're not saying because these traumas happened, like, bypass them, get over them, shift your attention, positive affirmation them away. We're saying you don't have to live in them. You don't. And you need to process that, right? Because if you don't process that, your body is going to tell you. And that's how disease happens. That's how, a lot of these things, these psychosomatic problems people have happen. Um, so yeah, we're all just doing the best we can, but it really is important, to do the deep healing work because no one's going to do it for you. And again, you're not the victim. Some of the things that happen to you are not right. Like, we know that. Some of the things that happened to our audience, to me, are not right. And they don't have to define us, but they do create and kind of shape us. That's absolutely true.
Yeah, it becomes a part of who you are. And that can be a good thing. It can be a really hard thing. I think, when it comes to, I've had a really strange relationship with victimhood. And, there's the type of life you've had, those experiences, they're tough. They're really tough. And none of us are alone. Like, we all have something, especially I think with that boomer generation. I hate to put a label on things, but generationally we've seen this progression. I'm Gen X, and we're kind of the confused generation. We don't know what's going on. We had these parents that were the way they were, and we're not quite a millennial yet. So we're kind of stuck in between. And I always think about, some of those things I see on TikTok, like Gen X, we had to drink from the garden hose. We weren't allowed inside the house, and we were expected home when the street lights came on, kind of a joke, but it's kind of real. We weren't really monitored. So we have this really different way about us. But the hard part about victim, that whole idea for me is is coming to terms with it. And I think in my situation, like, that was just normal life. I was surviving it. It didn't feel good. I too had a lot of um, different illnesses growing up. I was very sick when I think it was like fourth grade. Actually, before that, when I was 5, I had an obstructed bowel. Talk about root chakra. I almost died. They thought my appendix actually burst, but I mean, a very root chakra. And then later on, I had what they thought was mono, but they never really could diagnose it. I was very, very sick for about a month, and ended up losing my tonsils because they swelled up so large that it cut off my airways. Um, and then my gallbladder later on, lots of UTIs, lots of that kind of stuff. And hindsight is 2020. So I can look back and I can be like, yeah, okay, no voice, right? Root chakra stuff, no safety. And that's just how it felt. And what your brain does, though, when you go through that kind of reality, when that becomes your reality, is it tells a different story. And this is where I started to, I guess you could say, have like Stockholm syndrome or a trauma bond, where you tell a different story because that reality has to be what you live in. And so I was a little girl who was like, I was, always in fear of abandonment. I was emotionally cut off. I was screamed at, yelled at, hit, all the things. I watched animals get hit. I saw it all. But I was the one who'd be like, well, he had a really rough, young years, and he's really trying. He said he was sorry, and he gives me horses and things like that. I became the person responsible. So in a way, I then learned how to victimize my like self. I learned how to bring that back to me, and then it was pretty soon, you caused this. It's your behavior. And that was very reinforced. That's even reinforced now as an adult. Even with my parents' conversation, less than a year ago, that was the same narrative. And it was, you were just a really difficult child. No, I was a child that wasn't given a voice. I was a child that was denied affection. I was a child that was neglected. I was a child that was hit. I was a child that was screamed at. That's the reality. Now, why it's hard though, is because my brain learned how to make good of all of it. And it did that all the way till now. All the way till now. People can do horrific, and they have done horrific things to me because I'm pre-programmed for it. And it can suck, and it can hurt, and it can be awful. But I'm like, but it's not that bad, right? It's not that bad. And you tell a different story. This is the hard part about victimization. Now, if you want though to not have that be your everyday, you're going to have to walk through the depths of hell. And that's what a lot of people don't really fully understand. So, what I wanted to talk about was, first of all, you have to see it. You have to see it. One of the first books that I bought, and I wanted to show the audience, Was It Even Abuse? It sounds like such a stupid title. It's by Emma Rose Byham, Byham, for those listening. Was It Even Abuse? You know there's something wrong when this is the book that catches your attention online. It is a Was It Abuse book for dummies. And this tells you if you were victimized. And it's crazy, crazy. Um, Psychological abuse is still abuse. Physical abuse is obvious. Psychological abuse is sometimes worse. And so, anyways, this book, for reference, if anybody is like, maybe I am, maybe I've dealt with a lot of things and I don't know what's causing it. If you don't know, look through this. Reflect on past relationships, current relationships. So that was my first thing was, is it even abuse? Was I even victimized? Because you cannot address something you don't see. Because again, your brain's telling you this is what it looked like. So I read this book over a year ago and I still wasn't ready. Like I still couldn't undo that. Like, oh, maybe I caused this. Like that is the narrative my brain wants to produce. But it keeps me stuck in being the victim because I'm victimizing myself. So remember that. Like I was victimized, then I victimized myself. So I tried all the newer age suggestions. That manifestation, we talk about it being a gateway drug. I'm gonna write affirmations of who I am and what I want my life to be. Well, high bypassing. That's all it was. I kept trying to skip over to go to the good stuff. Well, I'll just rewrite who I am. I'll keep rewriting who I am, literally, figuratively. And I couldn't get through that. I couldn't get through the underlying rage and the underlying pain and the way that it was showing up in my life over and over. Like it was just waving a red flag, like, hey, you're still the victim. You're still being the victim. Man, it sucks, Ange. But what I realized recently, actually, is that I have to keep going back to it. Not because I want to stay in a familiar hell, because I want to get out of a familiar hell. I have to keep going back to it because my brain is wired to gloss over it. My brain is wired to make excuses. My brain is wired to manage their emotions and forego mine. And so I have to go back. I have to rewrite it. I have to reread it. I have to cry about it. I have to get really mad about it. And then I shut the book and I do something different. And I go love myself. And this is the hardest part. This is the grueling part because you got to keep going back. You got to keep going back until you see your value. That doesn't happen overnight, right? It doesn't happen overnight. You got there through this process. This process that's really hard to break. And it will take that process to get back where you are supposed to be. And I had recently read the book also, Let Them by Mel Robbins. And again, I highly recommend that, especially if you're in this mindset, because you can continue to be a victim to somebody too. But the stages are figure out if you are, face it head on, and then get away from them, get away from it. And that's the hardest part because, again, a lot of us are trauma bonded, right? Our brain is seeking the familiar hell because it's safer, perceived safer than the unknown. And so we got to let them. Let them show us who they are. Let them show us what our value is to them. Let them make their decisions. Let them feel the consequences. Let them have it. And then let you. Let me. Let me heal. Let me process. Let me find ways to give myself love. And this book is really good. And I think for anybody, no matter how big V or little v your victimhood or your trauma is, it doesn't matter. It's really, really good because it frees you up, and it allows you to become the best version of who you are. And that's our sole purpose. We are not a human being with a soul. We're souls that have human bodies. And we can't get back there unless we are willing to deal with some of this stuff that's been imprinted on our souls. It's been imprinted on us. And so there's a lot. I have a lot of past, a lot of present, but for anybody who has dealt with big victim stuff, whether it be grieving, and like you said, the eating disorders, the way we re-victimize ourselves, that's what we're doing. We're trying to get control, but we do it by punishing ourselves. That's what we're talking about, is that's remaining a victim. That's the label you're putting on the jacket, and it says victim on it, and you're wearing it out in public, and you're wearing it everywhere, and you're talking to yourself like you're the bully. You're the one victimizing yourself at some point. And so the harder choice is to stop doing that. I woke up yesterday with that in my head. Every day you have to pick your pain. Every day. And it's you get two different buckets of pain to deal with. One of them is the pain of going back and doing what you've always done, which has felt like hell and awful, and the dark night of the soul, and the suicidal tendencies, and like hopelessness. And the other pain is walking away from everything that comes from, and the discomfort of walking into an abyss of unknown, of having to recreate every ounce of who you are every day, all day long. Those are your pains that you get to choose from. But that's where you stop being the victim and you start being the director of your life. That's where you get true freedom. And that's to the point. You said that about politics. I watch people, and I was part of it. I was a big part of it back in 2020. Mine was more about medical freedom, but it fell into a political party. It just is what it is. And it was, there was a lot of victimhood in that. You know, I look back on it, it's like, why are we begging for freedom? Right? Like we're prisoner. Are we prisoners? Are you a victim? You know, we did some important stuff. It's not to say we haven't, but I still see people in that camp, and they're wearing that badge, you know, like you can't take my freedom from me. And it's like, no, not if you've already claimed it, they can't. And so what does that mean? And that's how it goes through your whole life. And it's about taking your power back. But if anybody thinks it's like the beautiful butterfly spreading its wings, it's not quite like that. It's
Nope.
you're like the maggot in the pile of, and it's really, really, really hard. Um, so I hope that this is a good resource for people, because your story, my story, the story of countless other people who have gone through really hard times. You were talking about the addiction, the food. I've had my own. So my addiction was a little different. I've been on the anorexic side of bulimia for a little while in high school. Never to the point that you did. It was I much preferred binge eating. I really loved the dopamine hit that I got from that. It's still a struggle I have to this day. So I tend to struggle with not turning to food for my therapy, and my body wants to hold on to all the weight because I live in fight or flight, cortisol, all that stuff. It takes a long time to get your body to a place where it's like, I'm safe enough. So, you know, I tend to fall backwards. I'm going to victimize myself by restricting my food, by, you know, going through a hard workout, whatever it is. It's all these things. So if you're sitting here listening to this and you're like, ooh, that I do that, just ask yourself why. What is it? What's the dialogue in your head when you do it? Because we're our own worst victimizers. So past is past, but now is now, and we got to choose.
And again, it's really liberating, when you begin to walk that path and see the control you do have, because so many of us have the ineffective copes we do because we feel out of control. And when we get off the merry-go-round and realize we could have done that a lot sooner and just kind of watch the circus around us, and be safe in that, it's empowering. And there was a book I read, oh gosh, maybe a year or two ago, talking about how, and it hit so hard with my reality because I, like you, dopamine chasing, the things I'm used to living in fight flight. That was my entire experience as a young child into my adulthood, which is where, I love coffee and caffeine. I used to love HIIT workouts. I love running because they surge cortisol. They surge all of those fight flight hormones. Well, on a cellular level, your cells actually create receptor sites for those, chemicals in your body, the adrenaline and whatnot. So when you begin to stop doing the activities that feed into that, it's like you're going in drug withdrawal.
Yes.
Because again, my baseline comfort zone, which it sounds asinine saying it, but if you're following this conversation, it makes sense. My comfort zone baseline chemistry is fight flight. It is not comfortable for me to
Same.
sit on my butt and meditate. I have had to learn to sit with the discomfort because that changes the brain. When you do the opposite of whatever your brain is telling you to do, every single time you're starting to break up those neural pathways. And so, as I reflected on that, I was like, oh my God, there's so many areas in my life where I've sought out, unconsciously, completely unconsciously situations that would spike my adrenaline,
Yeah.
and I'm not going to go base jumping or anything like that. But, on a daily level, like I was a adrenaline junkie and I didn't know it.
Yeah.
So it was very uncomfortable to slow down and learn, my brain was telling me when you slow down, you're lazy, you're not good enough. All these things that it meant about me by not running on 100 miles an hour all the time. So I had to challenge those beliefs too. Like, it's not ultimately true. In fact, our bodies need rest, and I wasn't sleeping when I was in the throes of all of that the last 5 years. It's not been until the last year, 1 year, that I have recaptured healthy sleep. So it's taken me, and I work with clients who, want this miracle in a month or two. And it's like, if I can be honest and tell you how long it's taken me, you're going to run screaming into the woods. Like,
Mhm.
there are no quick fixes. And, but it's about taking the right steps in the right direction because they compound. And, the benefit long term is astronomical. And I really believe, I have a lot of clients that are about our age. So, upper 30s, mid 40s or so, late 40s. I believe we're the generation where we are shouldering the traumas of all of our ancestors, and we are saying we're choosing differently. And we're that generational chain breaker. And it sucks because all of us are busting out in autoimmune. We're having cancer. We're having all these problems with our body because
Right.
our bodies are so overwhelmed with everything that we've been through, plus the epigenetics and genetics of our ancestors. So we're changing that though. And that is the beautiful thing about neuroplasticity. Our brains can change, which means our bodies can change. And our bodies are designed to heal when we get the obstructions out of the way. And it
Mhm.
starts with the mind. It starts with understanding what's happening in your mind. It starts with understanding the imprints that you have. And so, if that resonates, I mean, there's some great meditations too that are like loving kindness meditations that can begin to just kind of crack open that, shell a little bit to help you have some self compassion, to give you a little bit of distance from your own story because we can't see our own blind spots. We really can't when we're in the throes of our own bullshit. And so having that kind of unattached observer is amazing, or a trusted person, or a coach that can give you the tools, the advice, the feedback to really recapture control. I mean, you and I have invested tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars into our well-being, our mindset, our business growth, our health and wellness, so much money. And I would not do any of it differently because I've learned so much in all of it. And these are tools that I get to pass on to my kids. These are tools I get to pass on to my clients, my friends who are going through things. But I had to experience it first. I had to go through my own bullshit. And so, if any of this resonates with you, I hope you, learn something today. None of this is saying, again, we're not victims here. We've been through stuff, we all have, but I'm grateful for it. And I can look back now and say I'm grateful for everything. And I could a few years ago because I understood why it was all unfolding and had to happen the way it did. So, as always, if you have questions, comments, anything, we love to get feedback and hear from you, your own personal stories. I know we've both had a lot of people disclose to us kind of things they've been through because they feel safe when people are vulnerable about their own experience. Everything is not TikTok perfect. It's not Instagram pretty. We're real humans trying to figure this life out, and it's complicated and it's messy and it's beautiful. And we're all here doing it together. So we may as well rise together.
Power in numbers. Yeah. All right, guys. Well, thank you for tuning in. And until next time,
All right, see ya.
see ya.